You are standing in the doorway of your own son's dining room, and there is no chair for you at the table. You count them twice just to be sure. 8 place settings, 8 chairs. Your name on none of them. Your grandson, little more than a teenager now, won't meet your eyes. Your daughter-in-law is fussing with a centerpiece like it's the most important thing in the world. And your son, Bennett, is standing at the head of the table, already seated in the chair that used to be yours every Thanksgiving for 30 years. "Dad," he says, not quite looking at you either. We didn't think you'd be up for a big dinner this year. With everything going on, we figured you'd be more comfortable eating in the den." The den, a folding TV tray in front of a rerun of some game show, while your entire family sits 20 feet away laughing without you. You feel something crack quietly in your chest. The kind of crack that doesn't make a sound but changes everything underneath it. "Of course," you hear yourself say. "The den is fine." But it isn't fine. Nothing about this is fine. And as you turn and walk toward that folding tray table, alone, in a house you helped pay the mortgage on 20 years ago, you think about everything that brought you to this exact moment, and you wonder, not for the first time, when exactly you became furniture in your own family's life. 68 years old, and you'd spent nearly every one of them giving. Your name is Elias Kirkwood, and you built a modest construction business from nothing, starting with a secondhand truck and a toolbox your own father left you when he passed. You worked 6 days a week for 35 years so your son could have things you never had. A good school, a car at 16, a wedding paid for in full without him owing a single dime to anyone. You never asked for gratitude. You told yourself, the way men of your generation often do, that love was something you showed through sacrifice, not something you needed spoken aloud. Your wife Adeline passed 6 years ago. Cancer. Slow and cruel, and something in you went quiet after that. Bennett and his wife, Harlow, insisted you move into the small in-law suite above their garage so you wouldn't be alone, and you'd been grateful at first for the company, for the sound of your grandson's footsteps overhead, for Sunday mornings that still smelled like coffee and bacon the way your own kitchen used to. But somewhere in the last 2 years, something shifted. It started small. Harlow stopped setting a plate for you at regular family dinners, saying you probably wouldn't feel like walking down some evenings, without ever actually asking you first. Bennett stopped inviting you to watch football with his friends on Sundays, saying the noise might be too much for you now. Though your hearing was perfectly fine, your grandson Miles, who used to run to you the moment you walked in the door as a little boy, now barely looked up from his phone when you entered a room. You told yourself it was just the natural drift of families as children grow and lives get busier. You told yourself a lot of things in those quiet months to avoid facing the truth that was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. You were becoming invisible in the very house you helped build a life around. The final piece fell into place 3 months ago, when you overheard Harlow on the phone with her sister, voice low but not quite low enough. "I don't know what to do about Elias," she said. "He's not sick exactly, just slow now, forgetful sometimes. Bennett feels guilty even talking about it, but we've looked at a few places. Sunny Acres has a lovely memory care wing, even though he doesn't need memory care yet. It's really more about positioning him there before it becomes urgent. Positioning him there, like you were a piece of furniture to be relocated before it became inconvenient to move." You stood frozen in the hallway outside the kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling in your trembling hands, and felt something in your chest that you hadn't felt since Adeline's funeral. Not sadness exactly, something colder, something that felt disturbingly like grief for a life that hadn't ended yet. You didn't confront Harlow that day. You didn't have the words yet. Instead, you did something you hadn't done in years. You drove, alone, to the small storage unit you'd kept on the edge of town since Adeline passed, where you kept the last few boxes of her things you couldn't bear to unpack, along with an old filing cabinet from your business that you'd never quite gotten around to emptying. Inside that filing cabinet was a folder you'd almost forgotten existed. Papers from your accountant, dated a decade ago, back when the construction business was thriving and you'd made a decision quietly, without telling anyone the way you did most important things, to set aside a portion of every good year's profit into a separate account, a modest but steadily growing nest egg you'd built specifically in case Adeline ever needed long-term care that insurance wouldn't fully cover. She never needed it in the end. The cancer moved too fast for that kind of care to matter, and so the money had simply sat there, untouched, growing quietly for over a decade. along with a piece of commercial property you'd purchased outright back in the 90s, land that your old business partner had recently mentioned over coffee. A national retail chain was now aggressively trying to acquire for a new development. You sat in that dusty storage unit, papers spread across an old folding table, and did the math slowly, carefully, the way you'd learned to do numbers your whole working life. Just over $1.8 million. Money nobody in your family knew existed. Money that, if Harlow and Bennett knew about it, might explain, you realized with a bitter, aching clarity, exactly why they were so eager to position you somewhere quiet and out of the way before anyone thought to ask uncomfortable questions about your finances. You didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, you did something far more powerful. You started paying attention. You noticed, for the first time in months, how often Bennett mentioned struggling with the mortgage on the bigger house they'd bought 2 years ago. A house you realize now that they'd purchased shortly after you moved in, perhaps assuming your modest monthly contribution toward expenses was worth more to them than your actual presence. You noticed how Harlow had started subtly asking about your old business contacts, your remaining assets, your will, questions dressed up as concern, but carrying an undertone you now recognized as calculation. You noticed how your grandson Miles still watched you sometimes with something like the old warmth, quickly hidden whenever his parents were in the room, like affection for you had become something he needed to ration in private. And then came Thanksgiving, the night with no chair, the night that broke something quiet and long-suffering inside you completely. You sat alone in that den, folding tray table in front of you, a plate of turkey growing cold beside a rerun you weren't watching, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter 20 feet away. Your family, celebrating a holiday about gratitude, without a single thought spared for the man who'd built the very roof over their heads. You thought about Adeline and what she would have said if she could see this. You thought about your father, handing you that toolbox all those years ago, telling you that a man's worth wasn't in what people said about him, but in what he built quietly, without needing applause. And somewhere in that lonely den, staring at a cold plate of turkey, something in you finally, quietly, decided enough was enough. The next morning you called your old business partner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Louisa Calloway, who'd handled contracts for you for over 20 years and had since become a respected estate attorney in town. "Elias," she said warmly when she picked up. "It's been too long. Everything all right?" You took a breath. "Louisa," you said, "I need to update my will.
And I need you to help me.
Figure out exactly what my family doesn't know about what I actually have." There was a brief pause on the line. "Come in tomorrow morning," she said, voice suddenly serious. "Bring everything." I think it's time we had a very thorough conversation. That meeting changed everything. Louisa walked you through every asset methodically, the retirement accounts, the long-forgotten nest egg, the commercial property that had quietly tripled in value over the years, all of it carefully documented, all of it entirely unknown to the family, currently debating how quickly they could relocate you to Sunny Acres. "Elias," Louisa said gently, closing the folder, "you are, by any reasonable measure, a wealthy man. Why on earth have you been living above someone's garage, eating alone on a TV tray?" "Because," you said slowly, "I thought that's what family meant. Sacrifice without needing recognition. I think I forgot somewhere along the way. That sacrifice without boundaries just teaches people you don't require respect to keep giving." Louisa nodded slowly. "Then let's make sure the next chapter reflects exactly what you deserve." Together you drafted a new will, not out of spite, out of clarity. The following weekend, you asked Bennett and Harlow to sit down with you at the kitchen table, the real kitchen table, not the folding tray in the den. And for the first time in months, you spoke without softening your words to spare anyone's comfort. "I know about Sunny Acres," you said calmly. "I heard you discussing it, Harlow, some months ago. I know you've both been quietly preparing to move me somewhere out of the way, likely before you thought I'd become too much of a burden to relocate easily." Harlow's face went pale. "Elias, that's not—" "Please," you said, holding up a hand. "Let me finish. I also know that neither of you have ever asked me a single question about my finances that wasn't wrapped in some other concern. I know that I haven't had a seat at this table in longer than I care to admit. And I want you to know that I've spent this past week with my attorney, making some decisions about my estate." Bennett's jaw tightened. "Dad, what are you saying?" I'm saying, you continued, voice steady, that I have considerably more than either of you have ever asked about, because you were always too busy deciding where to put me instead of who I actually am. And I've decided that money will go where it's actually valued, not necessarily where blood alone dictates it should. The silence that followed was heavier than any silence you'd ever sat through. How much? Harlow finally asked, voice tight. Are we talking about? That, you said, is no longer any of your immediate concern. What is your concern is this. I'll be moving out by the end of the month. I've purchased a small home near the lake, the kind of place your mother always wanted before she got sick. I'd like my grandson to visit me there whenever he wishes. As for the two of you, you paused, letting the moment breathe. That depends entirely on whether you're capable of treating me like a father again, instead of an inconvenience awaiting relocation. Bennett's face crumpled, the mask of quiet avoidance finally cracking. Dad, I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. I told myself we were doing what was practical. I didn't think about how it must have felt from your side. No, you said, not unkindly but firmly. You didn't, and that's the problem. Practicality without love just becomes neglect wearing a reasonable-sounding excuse. Harlow, to her credit, began to cry, not performative tears, but something that looked, for the first time, like genuine shame. I was scared, she admitted quietly. About money, about the future. About growing old myself someday and ending up somewhere unwanted. I think I projected all of that fear onto you, instead of facing it honestly. Fear doesn't excuse cruelty, you said, but I understand it better than you might think. I've been afraid of becoming a burden my entire life. I just chose to handle that fear by working myself half to death instead of pushing the people I loved out of my sight. The turning point wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a quiet, painful honesty that had been missing from your family for far too long. 3 weeks later, you moved into a small house by the lake, sunlight spilling across old wooden floors every morning, a porch that looked out over calm water. Instead of a folding tray, table in someone else's den. Miles visited that first weekend, awkward at first, unsure how to reconnect after months of quiet distance. Grandpa, he said, sitting across from you at your new kitchen table, why didn't you ever tell us about the money? You considered the question carefully before answering. Because I didn't want to be loved for what I had, you said. I wanted to be loved for who I was. I think, somewhere along the way, your parents forgot there was a difference. I let them forget by never asking for better. Miles nodded slowly, understanding settling into his young face in a way that made you proud. I won't forget, he said. Not ever. The climax came 2 months later. At a family dinner you hosted yourself in your own home. At your own table. A table with exactly enough chairs for everyone, including this time, a small placard Miles had made without telling anyone. Reading simply, Grandpa's seat reserved always. Bennett saw it first, and something in his face broke open entirely. I'm sorry, Dad, he said, voice thick with emotion neither of you had allowed yourselves to express in years. For every dinner, every excuse, every time I let convenience replace respect. I forgive you, you said simply. Not because what happened was acceptable, because holding on to it would cost me more peace than I have years left to spend. Harlow, sitting quietly across the table, reached over and squeezed your hand gently. Thank you for giving us the chance to do better, she said. You looked around that table. Real chairs, real plates, real family. Finally seeing you clearly instead of around you, and felt something settle in your chest that had been missing for longer than you'd realized. Not vindication, something quieter and far more valuable. Belonging freely given instead of grudgingly maintained. 6 months later, you sit on your porch most mornings, coffee in hand, watching the lake shift colors with the sunrise. Miles visiting nearly every weekend now. Bennett calling simply to talk rather than to manage logistics. Harlow sending photos of small moments she thinks you'd enjoy seeing. You updated your will one final time. Not out of anger, but out of honesty. Providing generously for the family who finally learned to see you, while setting aside a meaningful portion for a scholarship in Adeline's name. For young tradespeople who, like you once did, build their whole lives, quietly with their hands and rarely receive the recognition they deserve. You think of that lonely Thanksgiving sometimes. The cold plate of turkey, the folding tray table, the silence that nearly swallowed you whole. And you think of the chair with your name on it now, waiting for you every single time, no longer something you have to fight to deserve. They denied you a seat at their table once, certain you had nothing left to offer. But a man's worth was never meant to be measured by the chair he's given. It's measured by the quiet strength it takes to build a new table entirely, and the grace it takes to still leave room for those who finally learn to deserve a seat at it.